Good morning, students. So today we're going to finish up our conversation on the aerobic respiration. Remember that last time we discussed the citric acid cycle and how the citric acid cycle goes about taking acetyl-CoA, removing a number of high energy electrons, as well as generating carbon dioxide that we breathe out. Now, we're going to see what happens to those high energy electrons and how they go about making the majority of the ATP that's actually spent inside of our cells. So remember that those high energy electrons were being transferred over to electron carriers such as NAD plus and FADH2. So here is NADH and here is FADH2. Now what's going to happen with these electrons is that the electrons are actually going to be transferred from NADH over to one of these complexes that's present on the internal membrane of the mitochondria. So all of this is happening on the internal membrane of the mitochondria. And you can see that these electrons are transferred over to one of these complexes. So if it's NADH, it's transferred to complex 1. If it's FADH, it's transferred over to complex 2. But once this happens, the rest of the steps are kind of the same. So once you transfer this high energy electron to either complex 1 or complex 2, it kind of goes from one complex to the next, kind of like a ping pong, right? So it goes from like complex 1 to complex 3, complex to cytochrome C, down to complex 4. And ultimately that high energy electron is transferred and actually reduces oxygen into a water molecule. Okay, so just like the carbon dioxide from the citric acid cycle is the majority of the carbon dioxide that we're actually breathing out, the oxygen that we're breathing in, this is where it's going. This is where it's needed in order to be able to have something for these high energy electrons to be transferred to in order to generate water. So let's see this. NADH has a high energy electron that we got from the dehydrogenases in the citric acid cycle, and also a couple from glycolysis, if you remember correctly. So NADH transfers its electrons to complex 1, then that's transferred to complex 3, to cytochrome C, which kind of shuttles between 3 and 4, and then finally to complex 4, where it's attached to oxygen to generate water. Here, FADH2, right, which also comes from the citric acid cycle. This was one of the weird ones, but we can consider it, kind of like NADH's sister, right? So we have FADH2 here. Same thing is happening. It transfers a high energy electron, but instead of transferring to complex 1, it transfers it to complex 2. Transfers to complex 2, and then that high energy electron kind of ping pongs all the way through the complexes, goes to complex 3, just like this electron, complex 3, and then here this is exactly the same. So complex 3, cytochrome C, complex 4. And again, complex 4 is where oxygen is being reduced into water, right? So the oxygen that we're breathing in, this is where it's being reduced to water. So what is the point of all this? Well, the point of all this is that in these, in transferring these high energy electrons from one complex to the next, what it's causing is conformational changes to those complexes. And the complexes themselves are proton pumps, right? So these are protein structures that are proton pumps, and when they change conformation because they grab onto a high energy electron, that causes this machine here, this protein machine, to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane, so from the matrix, from the inside of the mitochondria, into the intermembranous space. So every one of these complexes, complex 1, complex 3, and complex 4, all pump protons. Complex 2 is a little bit weird, as it's the only one that doesn't actually pump any protons, but can extract that electron from FADH and transfer it over to complex 3. And then we start to pump protons across this membrane. So what ends up happening is that we end up with a very high concentration of protons here in the intermembranous space and a very low concentration of protons here. So that should start to trigger your memory as to what happens when we have a high concentration of any substance in any solute on one side as compared to the other is that the energy is going to want to cause the energy difference between these two is going to want to cause these solutes, these protons, to flow back across, right? But this membrane, remember the membrane, because it's a phospholipid bilayer, does not normally allow charged particles to pass through. So what happens in the membrane? Well, it's actually, they give them a way to flow back through. So another protein complex here, this is called ATP synthase, provides it a little canal for this proton to actually flow back down its concentration gradient, so from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And as it does this, it actually physically turns this turbine here, which goes about squeezing ADP and an inorganic phosphate into a fresh ATP. So every time that this turns, it's going to be squeezing together an ADP and an inorganic phosphate. So we pump all these protons in here to actually build up the concentration of protons, and then we allow it to flow back into the matrix through this little canal through ATP synthase. So here ATP synthase is just the same on both sides here. These protons flow through and generate a giant amount of ATP. You can almost think of this as sort of like water falling down a dam, right? So as water flows down a dam, it turns a turbine, and that turbine generates a ton of electricity. Well, in this case, we have protons that are flowing down through this canal and then turn the turbine here, turn the turbine of ATP synthase, and generate a large amount of ADP and inorganic phosphate. So what is actually happening here at this turbine? Well, if we take a look at this turbine and kind of look at it on its end, if we turn it on its end, what it looks like is a series of protein complexes like this. So this is the bottom of that turbine, and what happens is that we have ADP and inorganic phosphate, and it comes in and binds to the beta-1 subunit. And as this gamma subunit turns, so it physically turns, it's actually changing the conformation of this subunit so that it squeezes together the ADP and inorganic phosphate, squeezes together and generates a fresh ATP. So they break this up into these three conformations of this subunit. So what we have here is the open subunit. So here we have no ADP or inorganic phosphate bound. Here we have the loose conformation where we have ADP and inorganic phosphate bound, but not yet squeezed together. And then we have the tight conformation here, and that's where the ATP is actually being formed. So as this turns, right? As this turns, we're generating more and more and more ATP. So we're really cranking that out. And what we end up with is probably about 36 to 38 ATPs being generated per molecule of glucose. So I think that sort of that explains the electron transport chain, how that works, how these electrons are transferred from either NADH or FADH2, how those electrons go about reducing oxygen into water. So this is where the oxygen is necessary from aerobic respiration, and how that pumps a bunch of protons across the inner membrane into the intermembranous space. And then in the intermembranous space, these protons then flow down their concentration gradient, at the same time turning the turbine of the ATP synthase to generate tons of ATP, between 36 to 38 ATP per molecule of glucose that is consumed. So putting it all together, what we have here is that as glucose comes into the cell, inside of the cytosol we have glucose is cranking out a little bit of ATP through glycolysis and at the same time generating pyruvate and NADH. We can think of NADH as being these high energy electrons and NAD plus being the electron carrier. So these NADHs are then shuttled into the matrix so they can take part in the electron transport chain. At the same time, this pyruvate still has some more business to do, and what happens is it's transferred into the matrix, where pyruvate is oxidized into acetyl-CoA. At the same time, it loses a carbon dioxide and generates another NADH. Acetyl-CoA goes through the citric acid cycle, losing the rest of its carbons, generating a little bit of ATP, and then at the same time generating a lot of these high energy electron carriers, these NADHs, that can then go through the electron transport chain, creating a high concentration of protons here in the intermembrane space, where they then flow through ATP synthase, turning the turbine, taking ADP and inorganic phosphate and squeezing it together to generate a ton of ATP. So there you go. So we have glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, electron transport chain that involves a lot of proton pumping, and then of course the ATP synthesis through these ATP synthases where they flow down their concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration.